Hello, welcome to the Tobey Book, Part 2. I'm Dan Buchanan, the history guy of Brighton, Ontario. This video series emerges from a virtual presentation I did on October 21st, 2021. It was actually the second presentation on the Tobey Book, the first one on February 17th, 2021. Both events were sponsored by the Brighton Public Library. The Tobey Book Part 2 will not include the part about the creation of the document, but we'll dive right into the content and provide more stories that emerge from the text. Both the Tobey Book Part 1 and Part 2 can be found in the form of videos on YouTube and on my website at danbuchananhistoryguy.com. The Tobey Book is Brighton's most important collection of historical information. It's a large red book that can be found at the Brighton Public Library, although it's not available for circulation. It contains 786 pages, printed both sides, all filled with text and images that tell the history of Brighton Village and surrounding area. The original collection of material for the book was undertaken by Wilmot Maxwell Tobey during the later decades of his life until his death in 1959. Mr. Tobey grew up north of Brighton, near Hilton, but lived most of his life in Ottawa. He was a mathematician and an accomplished scientist, known best as an expert in the Geodetic Survey of Canada. After the death of Mr. Tobey, an associate, Wilfred Sprung, took over the project. In the 1970s, a history student at Queen's University named Barbara Nyland undertook a thesis project which resulted in the Red Book. More recently, I undertook a project with the permission of the Brighton Public Library Board and Administration to scan the Tobey Book and provide a PDF copy for the library. That PDF copy of the entire Tobey Book can be found on my website, so please feel free to help yourself. One of the characters that I discussed in the first presentation was Edward Goodyear, who obtained the patent from the Crown for Lot 1, Concession 2, Crammy Township, in 1803. That land is highlighted here over a much later map that shows Brighton Village in the contrasting dark color. We can see that Lot 1, Concession 2 went from Main Street, where Sobeys is today, all the way north to Spring Valley. And the eastern boundary of that lot is along the old border between Brighton and Crammy Township. So if we're talking before the date, January 1st, 1852, when Brighton Township was created, then this land was in Crammy Township. But after that, it's in Brighton Township. Also note that this land includes Butler Creek, which runs south from Spring Valley. It goes through the Butler property and off to the west and then south and eventually empties into Presqu'île Bay at Gosport. To see how this evolved from Edward Goodyear, we go to page 71 of the Tobey Book. It says, Edward Goodyear sold to John Singleton in 1818 the east half of Lot 1, Concession 2, Crammy. During this period, interest was mainly shown in the land east of Yonge Street and Prince Edward Street and along those streets. If we could have met John Singleton, he may have said, yes, I bought in 1818 on the west side of Yonge, from Dorman Street north over Proctor Hill and extending north to where the road crosses the creek, about 1.25 miles north of Main Street. I did it believing that the real future lies on the east side of Prince Edward Street, which I've already bought. For is not business bound to be towards the bay, so as to reach the boats? John Singleton was 29 years old in 1818 and already well versed in the wheeling and dealing of real estate in Murray and Crammy townships. Besides being involved in the founding of Brighton Village in 1831 and having a street named after him, we can see lots of evidence of land transactions with his mother and himself in the land registry records for Brighton Village. John Singleton's father, George Singleton, was a soldier who fought with the British during the War of Independence. He was badly wounded at the Battle of Oriskany in 1777, but managed to survive. After the war, George Singleton and a couple of army buddies set up a fur trading post at the mouth of the Moira River, where Belleville is today. For a time, the small settlement there was called Singleton's Creek. Sadly, George Singleton died suddenly of fever in 1789, leaving the baby, John, and his widow, Nancy MacArthur. A few years later, Nancy married Alexander Chisholm, one of those army buddies of her husband. Chisholm was very ambitious, but no matter how many petitions he wrote, he could not get the authorities to grant him land at the mouth of the river. As a result, he came to Presqu'île Bay and squatted on Crown land north of what is Gosport today. By 1797, Alexander Chisholm had built a sawmill and a gristmill on the creek there near where it enters into the bay. This is the same place where many years later William Butler would operate mills. And in 1848 he would build the large two-story brick house. Now we can still see that house on the north side of the road. It was renovated by and is the home of Gordon Tobey. After all of this, John Singleton and his mother received many land grants and were among the most active players in real estate in this area for many decades. They were in an enviable position when Brighton Village was created in 1831 because they owned township lots that would be subdivided into village lots along the streets and roads. We don't have to look far for evidence of this. Here we see Lot 1 on the east side of Prince Edward. Anne Marsh, also known as Nancy, was John Singleton's mother after her third marriage. Every lot that they sold represented a good profit for the family. For me, this is a clear illustration that the policy of providing land grants for loyalists was very successful. It was designed to create a new society based on the distribution of land to conscientious people who were loyal to the crown. In some cases, these folks would settle on the land themselves and create productive farms. But in other circumstances, they would sell the land to other settlers who would create productive farms and build communities. Key to this system was the wealth that a small group of people would develop, which was expected to lead to the creation of an elite class in Upper Canada. For decades, the top level of this elite class in Upper Canada would be known as the family compact. On page 71 of the Tobey Book, John Singleton continues, "It is true that I was not as enthusiastic as Thomas D. Sanford about the west side of Yonge, selling to him in 1825 all west of Yonge from Dorman to the village line, which was just north of Proctor House, having sold the rest in 1824 to Benjamin Davidson for water purposes." Now, we'll get back to Benjamin Davidson and water purposes in a minute, but for now, let's follow the land transactions. Documents show that Thomas D. Sanford owned the property where Proctor House would be built up to 1840, when he sold a very small piece of property in Lot 1 Concession 2 on the west side of Yonge to Isaac C. Proctor. This map from 1860 shows the location where Proctor House would be built, there on the west side of Yonge Street. Then around 1853, a modest frame house would be built on that small plot of land on the west side of Yonge Street by Isaac C. Proctor and his two sons, Josiah Herman and John Edward Proctor. Several members of the Proctor family were heavily engaged in merchandising and trading in Brighton. And we have fascinating insight into that competitive and dynamic commercial activity in town based on numerous advertisements from the newspapers of the time that we find in the Tobey Book. These advertisements from the Brighton newspaper in 1853 suggest that two Proctor cousins engaged in dueling general stores. Around 1844, John Edward Proctor became involved in a general store in partnership with Abijah Squire. That store was located just east of the intersection of Main and Yonge Street. Johnny's cousin, Ira R. Proctor, ran a general store on the south side of Main Street just east of Ontario Street. As it says in this ad from page 267 of the Tobey Book, nearly opposite Ira Hodges' hotel. The verbiage of these ads suggests the dynamic activities of a modern merchant at the time. Not only did they sell a variety of merchandise in their stores, such as boots and shoes and patent medicines and, of course, liquors, but they also engaged in trade in lumber and barrel staves and shingles and wheat and ashes, whatever might turn a profit. The first line of Ira Proctor's ad suggests the competition between the two cousins. He called his store the new cheap cash store. No doubt business was brisk in both stores. The Proctors were so prosperous that by the 1860s, they were able to finance the building of a large new two-story brick house, which was built just on the south side of the existing frame house. At the same time, the older frame house was bricked up in order to provide a consistent look for the whole structure. Over time, the older section of the house to the north would contain the kitchen and the pantry and the woodshed and a drive-through carriage shed. Also, a distinctive belvedere was perched on the top of the new two-story brick house so that John Edward Proctor could use his spyglass to see which schooners were tied up at his wharf down at Gosport. This house was clearly designed to impress the neighbors, and it represents a perfect example of that big house on the hill where the rich folks live. Oh, by the way, did you see the signature on the sketch of Proctor House? It's signed Ralph. This is one of many pieces of art we see here and there that were created by Ralph Bangay. Now, we know Ralph better as the creator and operator of Memory Junction Museum, but it's clear by this that he was also an artist. In fact, Ralph was a multi-talented fellow. Speaking of Ralph Bangay, you should be aware of a project that the folks at the Brighton Digital Archives are working on. You probably know that Memory Junction Museum was sold to Kohl's Building Supplies, and they're using the property to store product. At the same time, the Bangay family has been very conscientious in handling the pictures and documents from Ralph's collections. There were several auction sales to dispose of artifacts, but the documents were held back. During 2021, a bundle of paper was delivered to the Brighton Digital Archives with the intent that digital copies of the documents would be produced. Scanning and cataloging is ongoing, and we can expect at some point to see a section of the Brighton Digital Archives website dedicated to these documents from Memory Junction Museum. These documents will be a wonderful complement to the videos that the Brighton Digital Archives did with Ralph and Eugenia several years ago, and that have been on the Brighton Digital Archive website for all to see. I want to thank the Bangay family for preserving a very important collection that will add significantly to the heritage landscape of our community.